Picture this. You're the second most powerful person in the world, and you've just engineered the greatest economic transformation in history. But here's the twist. Every policy you implement to save people is simultaneously setting up your own family for centuries of slavery. Today, we're diving deep into Genesis chapter 47, where Joseph's brilliant land policies, Israel's seemingly perfect freedom in Goshen, and the seeds of future Egyptian hostility all converge in God's mysterious plan. By the end of this episode, you'll understand how divine sovereignty works through human decisions and see the prophetic blueprint hidden in this pivotal chapter. So let me turn this over to someone who spent years studying the theological depths of this passage.
You know, Genesis 47 is absolutely fascinating because it shows us God's plan unfolding on multiple levels simultaneously. When Joseph brings his family before Pharaoh, according to the Enduring Word commentary, this was the fulfillment of both God's plan and Joseph's desire.
Right, but there's something strategic happening here, isn't there? Joseph doesn't just randomly place his family anywhere.
Exactly. The text tells us Joseph specifically chose 5 of his brothers to present to Pharaoh. And according to the pulpit commentary, rabbinic sources suggest he deliberately didn't choose the weakest, lest the king should select them for courtiers or soldiers.
Wait, so Joseph was actually protecting them from being absorbed into Egyptian society?
Precisely. And when they tell Pharaoh they're shepherds, this wasn't accidental. The Harvard Divinity Bulletin notes that migrants whose vocation included shepherding were despised by the Egyptians because the latter deified the ram as a holy animal, symbolizing the Egyptian god Ammon.
So their occupation actually guaranteed they'd be kept separate. That's brilliant.
And Pharaoh responds by giving them the best of the land, specifically Goshen. According to multiple commentaries, this wasn't just any territory. It was Egypt's prime real estate.
But here's what I find incredible. While Joseph is securing this amazing deal for his family, he's simultaneously implementing this massive economic transformation. Walk me through what's happening with the Egyptians.
Oh, this is where it gets really intense. The famine was so severe that first, Joseph collected all the money in Egypt and Canaan in exchange for grain. When that ran out, people traded their livestock for food.
And then?
Then they literally sold themselves and their land to Pharaoh. The text says, "Buy us and our land in exchange for food, and we with our land will be in bondage to Pharaoh." Joseph essentially created the world's first centralized state economy.
So while the Israelites are living freely in Goshen, every Egyptian has become a serf to Pharaoh. That's a massive power imbalance.
Exactly. And here's where Jewish rabbinic thought provides this incredible insight. The Chabad commentary points out that the Hebrew word for how Israel acquired property in Goshen is vaye'achazu, from achuzah.
What's significant about that word?
It has 2 completely opposite meanings. It can mean acquiring an estate, which symbolizes freedom, but it can also mean being grasped by the land, which implies being trapped and enslaved.
Wait, so the very word describing their settlement contains both their blessing and their future curse?
That's exactly right. The Chabad commentary says, this teaches us that there was a dark cloud hanging over their tranquil life in the land of Goshen. The children of Israel were heading toward a period of terrible slavery.
This is blowing my mind. So the Hebrew language itself is encoding the future. But let's talk about the typological aspect. How do early Christian interpreters see Joseph in all this?
The Gospel Coalition research shows that early Christian typology sees Joseph as God-ordained, author-intended historical correspondence that points to Christ. Joseph saves not just his family, but the entire known world from famine.
And the Adventist perspective adds another layer, right?
Yes, the Adventist Theological Society paper notes that the final 13 of the 50 Genesis chapters highlight Joseph's life with details that prefigure the Messiah. Dozens of parallels have been recognized.
But here's what I keep coming back to. Joseph's policies are creating the very conditions that will make Egyptian hostility inevitable. How does that work?
Think about it. Joseph has concentrated all power and wealth in Pharaoh's hands. The Egyptians are now essentially slaves to their own government. But there's this one group, the Israelites, who remain free landowners in the best territory.
So when a new pharaoh arises who doesn't know Joseph...
Exactly. The Bible Hub commentary explains that the oppression began with the rise of a new pharaoh who did not know Joseph. This pharaoh perceived the growing population of Israelites as a threat to national security.
And by then, the Israelites had multiplied greatly in Goshen, right?
Right. The text says they gained possessions in it and were fruitful and multiplied greatly. Meanwhile, every Egyptian was bound to serve Pharaoh. The contrast would have been stark.
This is where the prophetic element becomes really clear. Wasn't there an earlier prophecy about this?
Yes. The Harvard Divinity Bulletin points out that Genesis 15:13 includes God's prophecy to Abraham, and they will enslave them and torture them for 400 years. The pulpit commentary notes that when the brothers say they've come to sojourn in the land, this was an unconscious fulfillment of an ancient prophecy.
So they're literally walking into the fulfillment of a prophecy they don't even realize they're fulfilling.
Exactly. And here's something beautiful. When Jacob meets Pharaoh, he blesses him twice. The Enduring Word commentary notes that Jacob was 130 years old and described his life as a pilgrimage, knowing his real home was somewhere else, heaven.
That's such a profound perspective. Even in this moment of apparent triumph and security, Jacob maintains this eternal perspective.
And it connects to the deeper spiritual truth the Chabad commentary highlights, that wherever we find ourselves, we are charged with transforming that place into an estate for holiness, an oasis of spirituality.
But there's always that danger of being grasped by the very place we're meant to transform.
Precisely. The commentary warns that instead of elevating the material, we are grasped by it. The Israelites' experience in Egypt becomes this perfect illustration of that spiritual dynamic.
Let's talk about the historical context for a moment. The Harvard research suggests this actually happened during the reign of Ramses II, around 1225 BCE, right?
Yes, the Harvard Divinity Bulletin notes that new evidence shows that the Israelites actually did come to Egypt during the reign of Ramses II due to a great famine around 1225 BCE. There's even Egyptian documentation about groups from Edom migrating to Egypt because of famine.
And these migrants were forced into labor building cities like Ramses, which connects directly to the later oppression narrative.
Exactly. The Bible Hub commentary explains that later they appointed taskmasters over them to oppress them with forced labor, and they built Pithom and Ramesses as store cities for Pharaoh.
So Joseph's policies literally created the infrastructure and social conditions that would enable systematic oppression generations later.
It's remarkable how God's sovereignty works through human decisions. Joseph makes brilliant administrative choices that save millions of lives, but those same choices set up the circumstances for Israel's future bondage.
And yet, according to the To Be Like Christ commentary, the Bible writers constantly remind us it is God who permits countries to flourish and prosper, and God who humbles them and brings them low.
Right. The commentary notes that Egypt became extremely wealthy during the 7-year famine, but the credit belonged to God. It's this constant reminder that human power is always temporary and conditional.
There's something almost ironic about how Joseph's success in saving Egypt becomes the very foundation for Egypt's later judgment.
And that connects to the typological reading. Just as Joseph's suffering led to salvation for many, Christ's suffering leads to salvation for all. But there's also this pattern of how blessing can become a trap if we lose sight of our true home.
Speaking of patterns, the Gospel Coalition research emphasizes that typology involves escalation in significance. How does that apply here?
Well, Joseph saves from physical famine, but Christ saves from spiritual death. Joseph's family receives the best land in Egypt, but believers receive an inheritance in heaven. The pattern escalates from temporal to eternal.
And yet both involve this theme of sojourning, of not being ultimately at home in this world.
Exactly. Jacob's description of his life as a pilgrimage becomes this model for how believers should view their earthly existence, blessed but temporary, always looking toward their true home.
What strikes me is how this chapter shows God working through what appears to be purely political and economic decisions.
That's the genius of biblical narrative. The Chief Rabbi commentary notes that Genesis is philosophy written in a deliberately non-philosophical way. It deals with the deepest questions through story rather than abstract theology.
So, we learn about divine sovereignty not through systematic theology, but through watching how God's plan unfolds through human choices and their consequences.
Precisely. And the beauty is that every character is acting according to their own motivations and understanding, yet God's larger purpose is being accomplished through all of it.
Joseph wants to save his family and Egypt. Pharaoh wants to manage the crisis. The Israelites want safety and prosperity. Yet all of this serves God's covenant promises to Abraham.
And that's what makes this chapter so profound. It shows us that God's plans often work through apparent contradictions: blessing that contains the seeds of trial, freedom that becomes bondage, salvation that requires suffering.
It's like that dual meaning of akuza, acquiring an estate and being grasped by the land. Both are happening simultaneously.
And that becomes this eternal spiritual principle. Every blessing in this world has the potential to become a trap if we forget our ultimate destination and purpose.
So, when you step back from all this, what's the bigger picture? What is Genesis 47 really teaching us about how God works in history?
I think it's showing us that God's sovereignty doesn't override human responsibility or natural consequences. Joseph's wise policies have real benefits and real costs, but God weaves even the costs into his redemptive plan.
And it reveals that what looks like the end of the story, Israel safely settled in Egypt, is actually just the beginning of a much larger narrative of redemption.
Exactly. The Adventist research emphasizes that this connects to Christ's own pattern: apparent defeat that becomes ultimate victory, suffering that leads to salvation, death that results in life.
Here's what really strikes me. This chapter gives us a framework for understanding our own lives. We can receive God's blessings while maintaining that pilgrim perspective Jacob had.
Right. We can acquire our estate in this world, our careers, relationships, achievements, while never forgetting that we're ultimately sojourners heading toward our true home.
And we can trust that even when our circumstances seem to be setting us up for difficulty, God's larger purposes are still being accomplished.
Because as this chapter shows us, God's plans often work through what appears to be contradiction and paradox. The very policies that save Egypt become the foundation for its judgment. The very settlement that blesses Israel becomes the setup for their bondage.
But through it all, God's covenant promises remain sure. That's the ultimate message of Genesis 47. Thanks for joining us on Co-Pilot Podcasts. The next time you're trying to understand how God works through complex circumstances, remember Genesis 47, where divine sovereignty and human responsibility, blessing and trial, freedom and bondage all converge in one remarkable chapter that reveals the hidden blueprint of redemptive history.